Welcome back to Good Law, Bad Law. My guest on this episode is Theresa Cardinal Brown. She's an expert in immigration and is the immigration director for the Bipartisan Policy Center, a think tank in Washington, D.C. And she's been in and out of the Bush administration, the Obama administration, working on immigration for more than 20 years. We walk through all the hot button issues relating to the immigration debate, from the Dreamers and DACA to President Trump's calls for a border wall, the separation of families at the border, the impact on the economy. I didn't understand these issues halfway as much as I do now. I know you're going to enjoy this fascinating, timely, and informative episode. Stay tuned. My guest today on Good Law, Bad Law is Theresa Cardinal Brown. She's the Director of Immigration and Cross-Border Policy at the Bipartisan Policy Center in Washington, D.C. And of course, we're going to be talking about immigration today. Theresa, first of all, thank you so much for being on the program.
I'm glad to do it.
You and I discussed a little bit right before we started today. I want to take a step back because if there's one issue that has commanded the headlines, perhaps more than any other in the last many months, it's been immigration. But what I often find is, we watch the news media coverage, and there's a lot of focus on headlines and the politics of this issue, but really lacking in the coverage is a fundamental explanation of what's really going on and why this issue is so important. So I want to tackle this issue with that in mind as we get started, and we'll get into some issues more specifically about DACA and President Trump's interest in a border wall for border security and things like that. But before we do, as we always do, I want to get a little bit of background on you, Theresa. So give us some of your background. I know you've worked in both the administrations of President George W. Bush and Barack Obama, but give us a little background on yourself, if you would.
Well, I've been working generally in the field of immigration for well over 20 years. I started out, my very first job out of college was evaluating foreign educational credentials for immigration attorneys who wanted to help people get H-1B visas. Mm-hmm. And that was way back in 1990. That led to a job as a paralegal with a couple of successive, fairly large immigration practices at law firms here in D.C. But in the mid to late 1990s, I turned to work on immigration policy. So I did policy and advocacy with the American Immigration Lawyers Association, and then for 5 years at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. In 2005, I joined, as you mentioned, the government. I joined U.S. Customs and Border Protection in the policy office of the commissioner. This was under President George W. Bush, and I worked there helping CBP manage the new landscape under DHS for immigration and border policy in the post 9/11 environment.
That's the Department of Homeland Security, DHS, right?
Right, Department of Homeland Security, yeah. And after a year or two working with CBP, I then went to work directly for the department headquarters, DHS, in their Office of Policy, again, doing immigration and border work. I transitioned for a little while to do international affairs, specifically work on the U.S.-Canada bilateral relationship under the George Bush administration, things like the Security and Prosperity Partnership, and under the Obama administration, the Beyond the Border Agreement with Canada, which dealt with an awful lot of a wide variety of homeland security issues, but there was a lot of border and immigration-related stuff in there as well. I left the government in 2011, did my own consulting work for a couple of years, and joined the Bipartisan Policy Center in 2014, where I've continued to work on immigration and cross-border policy.
And tell us a little bit about the Bipartisan Policy Center. What is that organization?
Sure. So we are a DC-based think tank, or as our president likes to say, a think and action tank. Mm-hmm. We were founded about 10 years ago by 4 former Senate Majority Leaders, Bob Dole, George Mitchell, Howard Baker, and Tom Daschle. And the express mission of our organization is to try to bring proud partisans, Democrats and Republicans, together to develop policy answers to some of the most critical questions facing the country. And so we cover a wide variety of policy issues, everything from energy to healthcare to national security and foreign policy, financial regulation, fiscal policy, housing, and of course I run the immigration group here. We are by name and by design bipartisan. So everything we do is aimed at trying to figure out how we can get Republicans and Democrats to help agree, to develop consensus and principled compromises that can be politically viable.
And I know, and I'd mentioned this to you as well before we got started, there was an article in Politico back in February where 4 experts in the immigration on the immigration policy issues were brought into a room. You were one of those 4 experts, with the goal of trying to see what common ground could be reached among people from very different points of view on the immigration issue. And I thought that was fascinating. And I have a similar goal as we work through some of the specific issues to try to identify where can change take place and where might there be common ground on what has become such a politicized issue. But before we do that, again, I want to start with what will sound like very softball type questions, but I think important questions to make sure that we're on the same page, so to speak, as far as what the issue actually is. It's commonly said that we are a nation of immigrants, and that the Statue of Liberty and all of us in one way or another came to this country as immigrants, our ancestors did. But I want to focus today on the issue with our southern border, since that's something that has commanded such great interest. We'll have to save for another day, perhaps, the issue of the travel ban and what that means for refugees coming from other countries, and particularly what it may mean for those coming from Muslim countries. But I want to really focus on our southern border. And I had a conversation with a friend recently who had spent years working as a Border Patrol officer. And he said to me, if we would just enforce the laws we have on the books, we would be doing much better. And so I want to work our way towards that idea, and just set the table with the fundamental issues, Theresa. So give us an overview in the simplest terms. What is the problem with immigration today? Why is this something we're talking about and spending so much time debating about? What is the fundamental immigration problem today?
So I think one of the reasons that the issue has become very politicized is in part because there's not necessarily agreement on what's wrong. If you ask Americans, do you think our immigration system is working? You find very few who would say yes. Almost all of them would say the system is broken in some way. But then if you ask them how it's broken, that's where you start seeing differences and divergences. So there are some who will tell you that it's broken because, as your friend, the Border Patrol agent, said, we haven't been enforcing our laws, and therefore we have a lot of illegal immigration, people coming to the United States without authorization and remaining in the United States in an undocumented status. And that's the fundamental problem with our immigration system. You'll have other people who will say, the problem with our immigration system is it's very difficult to come legally. We have a very complicated immigration system. Judges have said it's second only to the tax code in its complexity. It's very difficult for someone who wants to come and legally immigrate to the United States to do so. There are very narrow pathways, and it takes a very long time. It's very expensive, and frankly, you can't do it unless you have an immigration lawyer to help you. And then there's another group of people who will say the problem with immigration is we just have too many immigrants, that our country doesn't need so many people. We let in 1 million legal immigrants a year and, who knows how many undocumented immigrants each year. And why do we need so many people? They are competing with us for jobs and taking government benefits, and that's the problem with immigration. Well, almost everybody says the system doesn't work. If you ask them what's wrong, people will come at it from their own personal angles.
Hmm.
And that's part of the conundrum and what makes it a politically difficult issue, because if you don't agree on the problem, then figuring out what the solutions are becomes much harder. Um, and I think, it's certainly a case that if you look at particular recent history with immigration law, the last time our legal immigration system was changed by Congress was in 1990. So, a couple of generations ago, frankly. And our country has changed, and the types of immigrants who want to come to the country have changed, and the types of immigrants we may need in the country for our economy, or our demography might have changed. So that's one of the issues. We just have a system that's old, and doesn't really reflect maybe what is necessary in today's economy.
And
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 then you
then
also have,
oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was going to say, and then you also have a system where, yes, we've had a lot of pretty harsh laws on the books about what to do with people who go around that legal system. But as the legal system has become more atrophied, if you will, and not meeting, there's been basically over several decades a growing tolerance for sort of not really enforcing the laws very
Hmm.
strongly because of the negative impacts that may have. So we focused a lot of our enforcement efforts at the border, trying to prevent new undocumented migration in the United States. But inside the country, we sort of said, we're not going to enforce necessarily too hard, because negatives happen when you do that. It disrupts communities. It disrupts employers and their workforces. It doesn't necessarily mean that people are leaving the United States. They just move to other places. And the impacts of doing that enforcement would be very expensive and very difficult. Um, so, I think that combination of factors has got us to where we are today.
Well, and then you alluded to this, I think, but an additional issue that complicates the broad question of what to do about illegal immigration is the fact that you have so many millions of people already in the country illegally, and what to do with those people, what to do with those people, what to do with
Mhm.
those jobs, what to do with their children, members of their family, and so on, right? That is another hugely complicating factor to the problem.
Yeah, even if you were to just say, what could we do to fix the legal immigration system, you're correct. You still have that very, very large problem to deal with. And again, that's another area where different people would suggest different solutions. But increasingly, I would say that the public has come around to sort of understanding that deporting that many people is, one, unlikely, and two, maybe not the best policy. Um, and I think a lot of Americans would like to be compassionate, particularly because you look at that, if you look at that population of people who are undocumented or unauthorized in the country, um, over 60% of them have been here for 20 years.
Mm.
Like, they have become part of America, whether we wanted it or not, but they have. Many of them are married to Americans, have U.S. citizen children. So it's not just about a person who is undocumented. It is about a family and a community that has grown around them and incorporated those individuals. And so you pull out that one person, and you are affecting a whole lot more people than just that individual. And I think that's one of the reasons why a lot of the American public understand that just deporting everybody is not really the right solution. So they're looking at other avenues. That having been said, an awful lot of Americans also say, yeah, but we don't want to be in the same place 20 years from now, right? So if we provide a legal way for those people to get right with the law, what do we do to prevent this from happening again? How do we enforce the law? How do we get back to enforcing the law in a way that can keep this from happening again? And I think those are two of the big policy questions and political questions that our leadership needs to figure out.
So we have to really break that down. Then we have to look at, don't we, separately, the issue of what to do with those unauthorized individuals and their families already here, as you point out, many of them having been here for many, many years, and what to do about, I think, what people now call border security to prevent further unauthorized or illegal immigration into this country. Um, Perhaps to strike a deal in Congress, you may have to be talking about those issues together in some way. But as you're laying out the issue for us, those seem to be very separate sets of problems.
The answers are separate, but as I mentioned, sort of, I think politically, certainly they are aligned.
Right.
And also, I think in the minds of the public, right? As I mentioned, we've done some recent polling. A lot of other groups have done polling, and there's actually very broad support, including among Republicans and conservatives, for some path to legal status for many of those who are undocumented in the United States, as long as they can, pass a background check and show that they're, supporting themselves and they're, trying to become part of our community. There's not a reason why we shouldn't be compassionate, but Americans also don't want to feel like we're being taken advantage of. And if doing that is going to encourage more people to come unlawfully, then how do we balance that? The question of our legal immigration system here and how that works is also part of the issue as well, because if our legal immigration system makes it much too difficult for people to get in, does that incentivize people to come in illegally? And
Mm-hmm.
how do we switch that incentive? How do we create a legal immigration system that encourages immigrants who can come and can become American and can support us and become part of America and make America, better, as immigrants traditionally have done? But how do we create a legal system that fosters that, that's sufficient for what we think America needs? And that's another question that's subject to debate. What do we actually need? So, you know, the pieces are all sort of related, which makes them very hard to untangle just on a
Mm-hmm.
policy level, but even more specifically on a political level. Because as I mentioned at the beginning, if you ask people what's broken about our system, different people will say different pieces of the system are their priority for fixing, are the most broken. And those different priorities don't necessarily line up. So you have some people who would say, well, our number one priority should be figuring out how to legalize those who are here in undocumented status and bring them out of the shadows and deal with that issue. And others will say, no, our number one priority is how do we prevent more people from coming in and joining that group of undocumented immigrants in the United States? And another group of people will say, no, our real issue is fixing our legal immigration system so that we disincentivize illegal immigration and we meet the needs of our country, and then we can deal with the other things. So that difference in priorities creates a lot of the political dynamic that we see.
And of course, the rhetoric from both sides, or really from all sides, I think tends to exaggerate or distort the problem. Everything from talk of a porous border letting in gangs and criminals and rapists and drug dealers to some of the coverage on this whole issue of separating of families, which tears at the heart. But I'm thinking of the photograph that was on the cover of Time magazine of the little girl who is portrayed as having just been ripped from the arms of her mother, until it turns out that isn't what happened. So there's a lot of almost frenzy, it seems, today on all sides of the issue that perhaps takes some attention away from what the real issues are and what the real solutions might look like. So, I mean, tell, as we're still setting the table here in defining the issues, Theresa, can you give us a sense of the scope of the problem? I mean, it's I think fascinating and so important to bear in mind that 60% of those unauthorized immigrants have been here for 20 years. What are some of the numbers that we need to have in mind when considering, on the one hand, the issue of those already in the country, and on the other hand, those who continue to come unlawfully across the border? What are the numbers
Sure.
that we're talking about?
So first, most estimates of the undocumented population in the United States put it at about 11.3, 11.4 million individuals.
Hmm.
The majority of them are of Mexican nationality, but there's a significant percentage of them that are from Asia, Central America, and Africa and other countries. As I mentioned, vast majority of them have been here a decade, some as long as 20 years, some longer,
Mhm.
which means most of them came, frankly, in the early 1990s. Um, most of them are now part of families in the United States, either families that came with them, came later, or that they created after arriving in the United States. Um, The majority of them are in the states that you would imagine: California, Florida, New York, Illinois, Texas. But there's a significant number of undocumented immigrants that have now moved to other parts of the country, primarily for work. So you have what are we call new gateway states, which are seeing increases in immigration, places like North Carolina and Georgia and Tennessee and Arkansas, places also in the upper Midwest. So it's not just those traditional immigrant receiving states anymore. Um, a lot of them are, working. We do know that. Some of the most, if they're undocumented, then they're working without authorization. They're doing it in any number of ways. They may have started their own family businesses and working for themselves. They may be working so-called under the table for other employers. They may have found a way to present, legitimate documents that don't belong to them to gain employment, or fraudulent documents. There's a lot of ways, but we do know they pay an awful lot in taxes. The government estimates that they pay a large part in Social Security and Medicare that actually has helped keep those programs stable longer than they otherwise would have, because they're paying into the system but can't get that benefit back. They're not entitled. So, I think there's a lot of sort of maybe misconceptions about a lot of that. There's a subset of that portion, the people that are known as dreamers. These are people who came to the United States when they were minors, as children. Many of them have grown up here, have gone to our public schools. Again, since many of the undocumented population have been here 10, 15, 20 years, you can imagine if they came as, 4 or 5-year-olds or infants, or even 7, 8, 9, 10-year-olds, they have essentially become American as they've grown up in the United States. The total estimate of that population is probably somewhere around 3 to 4 million. That's a little uncertain, but that's one of the estimates out there. And that is a population you've heard a lot of people talking about. The term dreamer comes from a bill that has been introduced since the early 2000s, called the Development, Relief, and Education for Affected Minors Act, or DREAM acronym. And so these individuals have taken that moniker on themselves to call themselves dreamers. So that's a little bit of statistics about the undocumented population in the United States. Let's now talk about legal immigration. So our legal immigration system has 3 primary pathways where people can come live and work in the United States permanently, so-called green cards, right? Or lawful permanent residence. The first is based on family relationships. If you are a U.S. citizen, you can sponsor a foreign national to come as your spouse, as your minor child or stepchild, as your parent, and there's no annual limit on the number of those green cards that can be made available. So as a U.S. citizen, you're entitled to sponsor essentially that immediate family to come with no restrictions or no caps, just however long it takes to process that. You can also, as a U.S. citizen, sponsor your adult married children and their families, although there is a limit on that, and you can sponsor your brothers and sisters who may reside abroad. So there is an annual limit on that. And because there are annual limits on those categories, depending on where you come from in the world, you can wait anywhere from 5 to 20 to 25 years or longer to actually immigrate in those categories.
Wow.
If you have a green card in the United States, you can also obviously sponsor your spouse and minor children. There are limits on that each year. You can sponsor your adult children as well if they're unmarried or married. So that's the first round, and about 60% of the green cards issued each year are based on one of those family relationships. So the majority of new immigrants to this country are coming because they're related to somebody who already has immigrant status in the United States or is a U.S. citizen. Another 17% or so of our green cards are given to people who are coming based on their skills. They have a job offer, or a number of what we call special categories. So that could be everyone from those who are extraordinary in their in ability, the Nobel Prize winners, the Olympic athletes, to people who have been sponsored in the United States for jobs that don't require much of an education, although there's a very small number of those visas available each year. It also includes certain categories for, say, religious workers, so some special categories in there. About 17% of our green cards each year are from those categories. That's called employment-sponsored immigration. And then the remainder are people who are either granted asylum in the United States or admitted as refugees, and we can talk about the difference between those two. And after a year having been granted asylum or having entered as a refugee, they're entitled to apply for a green card as well. So those are our three main categories. Over the last decade and a half, the average number of green cards issued each year through the legal system is about 1 million. It varies a little bit because I mentioned there are some categories that don't have caps, but around 1 million green cards each year. So we have a population in this country, 330 million. That's not a very high percentage of our total population. There are a lot of countries in the world that admit far more immigrants as a percentage of their own population. Canada is one of them. We admit, probably about less than 1% a year of our population. And there are countries, even developed countries around the world, that issue close to 10% of their population in new immigrants each year. So by that measure, we're not very high on the immigrant receiving list. But by absolute numbers, we do admit more immigrants than any other country.
And needless to say, if you come to this country with a green card through one of those three pathways, there then is an established pathway to become a U.S. citizen after some period of time, right?
Yes. So you have to first get a green card. There's no direct way to get citizenship. Actually, there are a couple. If you are a foreign child adopted by a U.S. citizen, you can get essentially immediate citizenship. But for most people, you have to have a green card first. And then you have to be a green card holder for 5 years in most cases before you're eligible to apply to naturalize, which is the process of getting citizenship. If you come and have a green card and are married to a U.S. citizen, you can apply for citizenship within 3 years. So for most people, it's a 5-year path after you've gotten a green card. And to apply for citizenship, you do have to pass some criteria. You have to show that you've maintained your green card, that you haven't committed any serious crimes, that you're a person of, quote, good moral character, and there's a lot of legal precedent as to what that means. You have to reside in the United States for 5 years. You have to have been physically present in the United States for at least half of that time. And you have to pass an English language test and a civics test. And then if you pass all of those measures, you can apply for it and be naturalized as a U.S. citizen.
So just on the issue of legal immigration, those million or so individuals who come legally to this country with a green card or as a refugee or someone who's granted asylum, what is the problem with that today? Are there concerns that some have that the number, even though you describe it as relatively low compared to many other countries, is a concern as far as that issue fits into the broader immigration debate, that there still are too many immigrants coming to this country? Or is it that there are not enough, that the limitations are too narrow or too restrictive in terms of people coming to this country lawfully?
So you will find people of both persuasions, both those who believe that we let too many immigrants in the country, and those believe we let not enough in, and they come at it from very different perspectives. The people who believe we have too many immigrants in the country tend to rest their position on a couple of different arguments. One is an argument about the economy and how many immigrants are necessary in the economy, and the idea that immigrants are taking jobs, or if we allow more immigrants in, more Americans will not be able to work, or the wages that can be earned are driven down. I would say that the vast majority of economists who have looked at the issue of whether or not immigrants lower wages for American workers or compete directly for jobs with American workers say that's in general not the case. That there's no broad evidence that widely spread in the economy, Americans overall are hurt economically by the arrival of immigrants. There may be specific cases, individual cases, and some may be at more risk, mainly those that are more similar either in job skills or language ability to new immigrants, and that could even mean more recent immigrants, but that those effects tend to be short-term and relatively small, and over the long run, that's not the case. But that is a widely held perception. There's also, I think, fears that some have expressed about, frankly, the changing demographics of the United States. So the Census Bureau has said that by 2030, white Americans will not be the majority of people in this country, that people of other races and ethnicities will be more of the population than white Americans. Many reasons for that, including the fact that white Americans are simply having many, many fewer babies.
Mm-hmm.
But we also, due to immigration. So that combination of factors is something that makes a lot of people uncertain about their place in the future, and so they are seeking to limit immigration for that reason. Again, if the problem, one problem, if you're looking at the other side of that, demographers will tell you that if we did not have immigration, the overall American population not only would be aging much, much faster. We already know we have a problem with our population getting older, but that it would be actually shrinking. And that countries that have seen this kind of demographic where the population is aging and shrinking have had significant economic issues dealing with that. So countries like Japan and Russia that have seen an aging and shrinking population and an aging and shrinking workforce have seen a lot of economic problems that go with it. I mentioned earlier that immigrants contribute into our Medicare and social insurance programs. Those programs are based on having the current workforce pay for the benefits of the current retirees. And with a shrinking workforce and a growing aging and retired population, that ratio is going down, and that is a very big issue for the solvency of our programs. If we don't have enough new workers coming in to the workforce to maintain the benefits of the current retirees, the systems will become insolvent much faster. So immigration is seen by others as a way to counter that. So as you can see, there are arguments that people are trying to make, but a lot of the immigration politics, frankly, you can talk about the facts and numbers all you want, but people tend to create their immigration positions based on their own perceptions of what has happened. And that gets back to what you said earlier. People who take sides in this debate try to shape those perceptions. So you shape those perceptions in a number of different ways. So you have some people who will, focus in on the fact that maybe there are some immigrants that commit crimes to make people feel that immigrants are a threat for criminality, and others who will say that, immigrants are just coming here and they are all, that child seeking asylum for their mother. The fact of the matter is immigrants are like any other population. The vast majority are not criminals. We know that. But yes, there are some that are. And so the question for policymakers is how do you create policy that adequately distinguishes, right? That is fairly looking to protect us from those who might be trying to do us harm, however small a percentage that may be, while at the same time figuring out an immigration policy that lets in those immigrants who can be good for America and are wanting to be good for America.
We'll stay on that issue for a moment, Theresa, because I think you're right. When we talk about perceptions about immigrants and about the immigration problem today, one of the issues that people often refer to, and it comes up in elections and campaign ads, from president on down to dog catcher, concerns about crime. How perceptions aside, what are the facts, or what do we know of the facts relative to, say, this 11.4 million undocumented, unauthorized immigrants in this country? Is there a disproportionate amount of crime in this population compared to the legal or U.S. citizen population? Is there anything we know about that factually?
So from the studies that we've seen, and there's, I would say this is an area that new studies are being made every day, that we historically did not have a lot of studies on this, but it's a growing field of research. The majority of studies so far have said that immigrants on average do not commit crimes at any higher rates than Americans. In fact, immigrants are less likely to commit crimes than Americans. And you can imagine for a number of reasons. One is until you're a citizen, commission of a crime can render you deportable, right? If you're undocumented, commission of a crime could render you, captured by immigration enforcement and deported. So most immigrants have a strong disincentive to commit crimes in the United States. There have been some studies that have tried to look at the population of non-citizens in jails. In federal prison, it's true there are an awful lot of non-citizens. Most of that is because violations of the Immigration Act that can be charged criminally can only be charged in federal court. And so if you commit an immigration crime and are charged, you will go to federal prison. And the federal government, under several administrations, has significantly ramped up their prosecutions of people for immigration crimes. So immigration crimes in this case means entering illegally can be a criminal offense, and that's frankly the underlying issue with the family separation policy is the government decided they were going to do 100% prosecution of that crime for people who entered. People who have re-entered a second time after being deported, that then becomes a felony crime. And that crime has been prosecuted by governments since the Bush era. So that has led to a lot of people in federal prisons. So I would argue that, yes, it's true there's more immigrants in federal prisons, but that's not a true sense of who commits crimes, if you will, because it's skewed so much by the immigration prosecutions. At local jail levels, we have less information, in part because we don't have a nationwide system that systematically collects data from local jails. Right, it's not centralized. So it really depends on what states collect and localities, because most jails in this country are actually run by counties, not even by states. And so it's harder to get information on that. But the data that we have seen, again, seem to show that immigrants are less likely, and that a lot of immigrant crime, frankly, is aimed at immigrant communities. Now, if you look at border security, again, looking at federal crime statistics, most communities along the border are actually safer than the average U.S. city in terms of property crime or serious violent crime. So cities like El Paso have some of the lowest crime rates in the country, even though they're right along the border. So again, the evidence is not completely there, but the evidence that we've seen are that immigrants don't necessarily commit crimes at any higher rates than Americans.
Now, I know you said this, Theresa, but I just want to underscore the reason why we see any number of illegal immigrants in federal prison, particularly a significant number, as you said, is because, and I'm not sure this is obvious to most people, but the system of immigration laws that we have are federal laws, and therefore those laws are enforced. And if people are sent to prison, they would be sent to a federal prison, those being federal laws. But talk about deportation a little bit, because that, again, is one of those things that you hear a lot about, and I think there's a lot of myth and misunderstanding and distortion of fact about. What I have read, and I'm interested to know if this is grounded in factual reality, is that the actual number of deportations has been increasing over the years. In other words, if you're caught in this country committing a crime and you are here unlawfully, you are deported in increasing numbers since the last 10 years or so. Is there something to that, and what is the Trump administration doing in terms of deportation numbers?
Sure. So the numbers of deportations increased significantly actually in the first part of the Obama administration. So the Bush administration had started ramping up some interior enforcement activity, but really in the first 4 years of President Obama's presidency, his administration really ratcheted up the number of apprehensions and deportations, so much so that they were deporting close to, I think, about 500,000 people at the end of the term. And it's still, the total number of deportations under the Obama administration is higher than under George W. Bush or President Trump. So Obama has that record right now. He is what the president of the National Council of Lawyers also called him, the deporter in chief. In spite of changes in policy later in his administration that provided more relief from deportation, he still, because of that first term, deported more people.
And are
than his
those,
successors
Teresa,
had.
are those people who are deported? You said it was up to 500,000 a year under President Obama. Uh, First of all, coming into this country, crossing our southern border illegally without authorization is itself a crime. But are the people who are in that number, who are the focus of deportation proceedings, people who've entered the country illegally, or people who have entered the country illegally and then who committed some crime in this country?
So that was a focus of a lot of discussion during the Obama era. The
Mm-hmm.
president stated that his priority was to deport people who were deportable because of immigration violations, but who had also committed or been convicted of other crimes while in the country. That was the priority. His famous phrase was "going after felons, not family." But
Mm-hmm.
I'd say that was debatable because many immigration advocates, in looking at the data, insisted that in addition to deporting people who had committed other crimes, there were an awful lot of people who had not done so that were also deported, or whose crimes they may have committed were very, very minor crimes, like driving without a license, right? So one of the issues with that prioritization under the Obama administration was, where are those lines? Who really is a priority for removal and who should not be a priority for removal? And that was the whole concept of prosecutorial discretion. In other words,
Mm-hmm.
the administration argued that it had the right and the responsibility to determine who it would prioritize for removal, because the government does not have, and this is true today, sufficient resources to deport everyone in the country. Congress allocates the monies for this process and has never allocated enough that would enable a government to deport everyone who is in the country. So they must make choices about who to prioritize. Those choices, again, changed in the later part of the Obama administration. They issued some memorandums within Department of Homeland Security that tightened that focus on those who had committed the most serious crimes after having come in the country. And then the rates of deportation under Obama did go down in the last part of his administration. Now, under President Trump, they repealed those priorities and issued a new set of priorities that still focused on criminality, but not to the same extent, and basically said that anyone who is unauthorized in the United States, either having crossed illegally or having entered legally but later overstayed or violated the terms of their admission, could be deported. And so arrests inside the country have actually gone up under President Trump, but in part because most of the cases have to go through immigration court before the individual can be removed, and the immigration courts are very backlogged. There's actually been fewer actual deportations under this administration than under Obama.
So is it that more of the deportation proceedings under President Trump are more of those for, and I don't want to mischaracterize, but what I'd call simple immigration violations, entering this country illegally, as opposed to for what I think you called criminality while in this country?
Yeah, the number of people arrested by Immigration Customs Enforcement inside the country under the Trump administration who do not have another criminal record has gone up from where it was under Obama. They are still arresting those who do have crimes, but the percentage that do not have other crimes is higher under President Trump than it was in the latter part of the Obama administration. So again, many of them are just being arrested because they don't have status and are being put in deportation proceedings for that.
Well, let me turn to the question of the 11.4 million people who are in this country now. And as you pointed out earlier, many of those have been here for many years, as many as 20 years. They have families, they have jobs. We talked about the economic impact of immigration. I would think that if more of those 11.4 million were legalized, there would be even more economic benefit to the country in terms of paying into Medicare and Social Security, in terms of paying taxes generally. Um, why does it seem that there is now a renewed or an intensified focus on uh, the fate of those people, and as you said earlier, there seems to be I don't know if there's a consensus or if it's a majority or if it's a general sense that we want to be compassionate. We also want to be economically smart about what to do with these people and their families. What really are the arguments at this point in terms of the Dreamers, which also includes uh, DACA, which a lot of
Hmm.
people have focused on, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. That's DACA. What really are the fundamental debate points as far as what to do with these individuals, millions of these individuals already in the country?
Sure. So again, like the two sides. For those who support some form of legalization for this group, there's a lot of arguments. Some of them are about, the sense that, look, we just don't have fiscally, it makes no sense to invest the resources that would be necessary to deport this number of people. And I think that's a huge argument. That's actually a very bipartisan argument. You hear Republicans say that as well, like who support sort of fiscal responsibility in the government. The fact that they have been here and become part of the communities means that there's a sort of a humanitarian aspect to this as well, right? Unless they've committed some other serious crimes,
Mm-hmm.
if all they're doing is trying to stay here and work, and they've already become, they're married to U.S. citizens, that trying to deport them would break up families, it would harm communities and harm the local economies and even the national economy. Is that what we want to do ourselves? I think those are some of the strongest arguments for the advocates in favor of legalization. I think for those on the other side, the biggest argument they have is the rule of law argument. These are people
Mm-hmm.
who have broken the law, they have broken our immigration laws, and that rewarding them by providing them with a path to legal status would simply encourage more people to break the law. And we need to stop that cycle somewhere. And there's no good time to do it, but we should do it now. I think that's probably the primary argument you hear against so-called amnesty.
Mm-hmm.
But again, if you polling on this, and there's been a lot of polling on this, has shown that a majority of the American public does support some way to legalize the status of those here. Now, there's a different question about whether those legalized should be eligible to later get citizenship, but at least in terms of making them legal, there's broad majorities of support, Republicans and Democrats, for doing that in some way. Now, almost all of that is contingent upon some pathway. In other words, it's not just we're going to let you off the hook and you'll get a status right away, but you have to do a background check. You may have to pay a fine, pay taxes that you owe, maybe pass some English tests. Like, there are criteria. But I think again, majorities would say that seems like a rational thing to do. That doesn't mean they don't also have concern about whether or not it would encourage future illegal immigration. And so that's why those conversations are almost always coupled with, what do we do about border security?
And well, I have to take on two other issues with you before we wrap up, because I think there's so much fire and smoke around these issues. But I want to continue what I think we've been doing so far in this conversation so well, which is push aside the smoke and the fire, and really try to get at what the real facts are and what the real issues and concerns are. One is the border wall. President Trump campaigned heavily on that, made loud promises about a border wall. And in the news this week is how seriously threatening, it's hard to say, but at least is verbalizing threats to risk shutting down the federal government unless he gets funding for his wall along the southern border. And secondly, this issue of the separation of families, which we've touched on. Let's maybe take them in reverse order. Um, what can you break down that issue for us? I mean, on the one hand, it obviously is on a human level, it is just heartbreaking to think of parents and children being separated and children being placed in these detention facilities and so on. But it is also true that if you are an American citizen and you commit a crime and you go to jail, you will be separated from your children necessarily. Um, we may accept that by not focusing on that very much, but I think that's also the reality. So, how does this issue break down, and how does it play into the broader issue of border security and uh, any hope of deterring future illegal immigration into the country?
Sure. So this issue of, the punishment, if you will, for illegal immigration. I mentioned that in the mid 90s, we passed a very harsh law called the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act that substantially increased the potential penalties for illegal or undocumented immigration to this country. In the years since, both under the Clinton administration that signed it into law, George H.W., George Bush, there hasn't been a heavy emphasis on enforcing all the pieces of that, in part because strict enforcement of that law would have consequences that many felt would not be politically palatable. Um, this administration has taken that very seriously and said, no, we are going to enforce the law. And one of those is what results in the family separation. So as I mentioned, what happened, it started in May when Attorney General Jeff Sessions announced that Department of Justice would prosecute every single person who attempted to come into the country illegally between the ports of entry. A misdemeanor offense. Most people that go through that process are sentenced to no more than time served, which could be, a few days or a week. But once somebody is put into the criminal justice system, criminal prosecution, they are taken out of the immigration detention system and put into jail. Well, for many, many reasons in this country, if you go to criminal jail, you cannot take children with you. So if someone arrives between the ports of entry with a child, and the adult is prosecuted, the child necessarily is then separated from that adult. The child goes into immigration proceedings, and I want to emphasize, this is important, something that a lot of people don't understand. Immigration removal proceedings, deportation proceedings, going for an immigration judge are not criminal proceedings. Those are administrative proceedings. The immigration judge is an administrative law judge. That judge is an employee of the Department of Justice. This isn't a criminal court, even though it has some of the dressings of a criminal court. It is not a criminal court. That is an administrative process. So the child goes into that administrative removal process. Their case is now separate from that adult. The adult goes into the criminal justice process, goes before a U.S. magistrate judge, probably with 70 or 80 other immigrants who arrived about the same time, is sentenced essentially to time served, then goes back into the administrative immigration process for removal. But because the separation had already occurred, their case is now separate from that of the child they arrived with. This is the crux of the litigation that's ongoing now, the trying to reunite these parents with their children, because the systems, once they separated those cases in the administrative system, were not built to bring them back together. And so that's been a lot of this ongoing litigation. I bring it back to...
Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, I was going to say, I bring it back to, so family separations, this idea of family separations, the policy that caused that was this zero tolerance policy, fully enforcing the ability to criminally prosecute people who cross the border. So this is why some people say that fully enforcing immigration law has consequences that may or may not be acceptable to the American public. And the pushback that people saw to this separation that happened as a result of that is one of the reasons, right? We saw a lot of pushback, bipartisan Republicans and Democrats saying, this may be enforcing the law, but this isn't the way to do it. The bigger question, and I think is important, is are we trying to do this as punishment, right, or as deterrence? And the government has kind of sent mixed messages on that. But many in the government have said we're trying to deter other people from doing that. But there's an open question about whether or not these policies actually deter people. And part of that is because the people who are arriving are very different than the people who used to come. So I mentioned back in the 1990s, we had a large number of people coming in illegally to this country. Over 1.5 million a year were apprehended in the early years of the George Bush administration, even the early part of the Obama administration. We are way, way below those numbers. Even in the last year, we've seen some uptick in the number of people apprehended at the U.S.-Mexico border. we're still talking about a maximum of 400,000 people.
Mm-hmm.
That is way, way below where we were in the early 90s. 1.6 million a year, 400,000 a year. And it's a different group of people. In the early 90s, 99% were single Mexican men coming for economic opportunity. Almost no one asked for asylum. They were apprehended, they were deported, they may try to come back, but it was single men. Now, almost 40% of those arriving are these families or unaccompanied children or women, and a lot of them are applying for asylum. Once they ask for asylum, then the process for dealing with them differs because they can't just be deported. They have to be given a hearing in their asylum claim in immigration court, and that process takes a lot longer. So our immigration systems have not caught up with the changes in who is coming, even though the absolute numbers are lower.
Well, I think that's a hugely important point about the numbers of people coming. But on this issue of the increased numbers who are coming seeking asylum rather than economic opportunity, what really is the alternative? Because we've seen in the front pages and on the television the images and everybody. I mean, I can't imagine a person who isn't horrified by those images. But then the question is, okay, what are we going to do about it? Because while, as you described, the immigration court system is hopelessly backlogged right now. It can't handle the numbers of people it has to deal with and process. The criminal justice system was caught blindsided by this new priority scheme that was announced in May by the Attorney General. So we don't have the mechanism to handle and process these people. So whether people are coming through this way or that way, seeking asylum or on some other basis, aren't they just leaking into the country while the courts kind of run around in circles trying to get their hands around the scope of the problem? And so what do you do? How do someone's waiting for a date to appear before an immigration judge, and off they go, never to be seen again?
Well, there are alternatives to detention. One of them is literally called alternatives to detention, and it can be everything from putting someone in an ankle bracelet to a community relations program where you have them check in with a nonprofit organization and then check in with Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Both of those programs, one, cost a lot less than detention, but two, have proved significantly effective in getting people to show up for their immigration cases.
Why are we doing that? That's a great idea, the ankle.
Well, I think Congress is trying to encourage ICE to do a lot more of that. However, what the government says is that those programs don't have the same quote-unquote deterrent effect that detention does. And again, this gets back to this question of deterrence. One of the open questions, and we don't have a lot of data on this, but there's a big debate, is whether one, deterring asylum seekers is legal, right? We have legal obligations to allow people to apply for asylum. It's both part of our domestic law and international covenants that we have agreed to as a country. So that's an open question. And two, realistically, if people believe they are fleeing for their lives, what's it going to take to deter that population, right? Like from coming in the first place? Do they stay where they are if they're sure they're going to get killed or their child is going to get killed, or they take a chance and try to apply for asylum? So we don't really know what deterrence might look like for this group of people. And would the type of deterrence be one that we are willing to accept as a country? It seems like the policy of family separation may not be one that we are willing to accept as a country in the name of deterrence. What you asked, what are the other options? One I mentioned is alternatives to detention. Two is we need to significantly invest in our immigration courts. One of the reasons there's such a huge backlog is that as we have invested billions of dollars in border enforcement, we have stagnated our immigration courts. The number of immigration judges hasn't risen in 15 years, even as the number of cases going in has increased. So that's something that Congress could fix. If they took even a small portion of what they are trying to invest in detention centers and removal operations and invested that in the immigration courts, we could make a big dent in that backlog. So that's something that Congress really needs to look at is just maybe, significantly wrapping up. Not only would be able to make a dent in the backlog, but if we could start making those cases go faster. So it's not 2 years after you admitted into the country to wait on your immigration hearing before you know if you're going to be deported, but 3 months, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if those cases are decided fairly quickly and you know whether you can stay or go, and a significant number of them will probably not be able to stay, and they are then deported, that then might change migration behavior. So that's something to think about. The other thing is we need to look at this in a much bigger picture. If this is not, if our future migration flows are not going to be significantly about Mexico, but about Central America, what are we doing in those countries? How do we support them and improve the conditions that are causing people to leave? That's both rule of law, that's dealing with crimes and gangs and cartels, that's dealing with their economic situation, and what can we do in those sending countries so that they don't feel the need to leave?
In
In the
other words,
meantime,
a smaller investment of money invested in programs in those countries might go a lot further in deterring immigration than enforcement at the border.
I believe that's true, and it's certainly part of the conversation that doesn't get talked a lot about in the press and really needs to be. If we're looking about how we manage migration, you can't manage migration just at the border. You have to look at the entire continuum, everything from what's going on in the sending countries, what's happening along the transit routes, how is Mexico dealing with the smuggling cartels and others that are facilitating this? Is Mexico willing to try to help us with accepting asylum applications for some of these people? They have increased the number of asylum applications they're taking. What we do at the border matters, and then what we do inside the country with our immigration courts. What happens after somebody arrives, and how do we process that case? It's the entire continuum that we need to look at, not just what we do at the border.
All right, so let's talk about the last thing I promised and we have to talk about it because it's back in the news this week again, and maybe one of President Trump's most signature campaign promises while he was on the campaign trail running for president, which is the border wall. And I know because I read this article in Politico again, and I want to post a link to that article in the description for this episode because it's a fascinating discussion about all the issues we've been talking about today. I know you have a fairly practical approach to the issue of the border wall itself, but as you've done on all these other issues so far today, lay out for us, Theresa, what this issue is and how it plays into all of what we've been talking about so far.
Sure. So, as most people know, President Trump, during the 2016 campaign, promised to build a wall along the U.S.-Mexico border to stop undocumented immigration, to stop drugs and guns and criminals and everything else from coming in from Mexico. And he promised that Mexico would pay for the wall. It was a signature campaign promise. It came up at every one of his rallies. Build that wall was a huge chant.
Right.
So for President Trump, this is not, I think, even as much about what is a good policy, but it is about fulfilling a significant campaign promise. So that is one of the reasons why he is so insistent on building the wall, even though it's clear at this point that Mexico is not going to pay for it. He has asked Congress to pay for it. And as you mentioned just this week, again, threatened to shut down the government unless Congress paid for the wall. So the wall itself, even though he's talked about a big concrete wall, if you remember last year, Customs and Border Protection, the border agency, contracted with several people to build prototypes of what the wall might look like. And some of them are solid and some of them are more fence-like, and they're determining which would be best. The answer is it's not going to be a single type of barrier all across the border, and it may not be even everywhere along the U.S.-Mexico border because the terrain along the border is very, very different in every location, from San Isidro and Tijuana in California all the way to Brownsville in Texas and the Rio Grande. So what the wall might actually look like, no one knows. The total cost of the wall is also something we don't know because we don't know what kind of wall is going to be built or where. That having been said, I think if you ask the public about the wall, most people see it more as a symbol that we are
Mm-hmm.
taking border enforcement seriously than actually a pragmatic, practical answer to border security.
Right.
And even if you talk to the people whose job it is to secure the border in the Border Patrol, they will say, yes, we need a wall in some places. We also need other types of barriers, other types of technology, more people, right? It's a combination of things that we need to secure the border.
I mean, what about drones? I mean, if we increased drone use along the border.
There have been alternatives offered in Congress to the wall
Mm-hmm.
that include a lot of that kind of technology,
Right.
sensors and cameras and infrared and radar and yes, drones and all kinds of things that can help secure the border, not just the wall. But for the president, of course, um, that kind of nuance doesn't come into his tweets, right? He's talking about the wall, and clearly he wants to be able to say that he's built a wall. Politically, though, again, it becomes what is the trade-off for the wall, right? So last year and this spring, there were attempts in the Senate and the House to try to address the status of the Dreamers, right? There was a threat. The president said he was going to wind down the DACA program that we talked about earlier that President Obama had put in place that temporarily protected certain Dreamers from deportation and gave them work authorization, and asked Congress to pass a law to fix it, right? They tried. Almost every one of those pieces of legislation that were proposed was some sort of trade-off between status for the Dreamers and the DACA recipients and wall. At one point, Democrats in Congress offered President, we will give you the $25 billion you want for your wall in exchange for the Dreamers. The president didn't take that deal. He asked for more. He asked for changes to the legal immigration system. He wanted to change family migration. He threatened to end the so-called diversity lottery, a program that has 50,000 visas a year allocated essentially by a lottery system to people coming from countries that have not had a lot of immigration in the United States in the past. He wanted those kind of changes. He wanted changes to how people arriving at the border are treated. And so those deals fell through and were never able to come through. So here he is threatening again over the wall. But then if you look at his tweets, he's also again talking about changing the legal immigration system and closing so-called loopholes. So one of the difficulties of Congress addressing immigration, I go back to the beginning, is what do people think is broken? And clearly the president thinks that certain things are broken, but he's not looking at other pieces that other people have priorities. The Democrats, for example, are looking at legalization. And that's one of the challenges. So he's trying to threaten a shutdown over these things, but Democrats are going to say, well, if you're going to get those things, we want to look at a pathway to citizenship for the undocumented, right, or we want different kinds of changes to the legal immigration system, and we don't want to see this idea that family migration has to be limited, right? So that's what politics is about. That's what legislating is about. Unfortunately, the kinds of compromises that are necessary for big, complicated legislation to go through are never going to satisfy all of the political base of both sides. And to the extent that the president is insisting on certain of these things because he's looking ahead to his reelection, or Republicans have their own races, or even Democrats have their own races, that's part of the issue, is trying to come up with what is a package that can get enough people on board to pass that the president is willing to sign. And that's proved, not possible so far.
Well, the other issue, and we can end here, as you pointed out, we haven't had major immigration legal reform in 30 years, and we often hear when this debate, is engaged, that we want comprehensive immigration reform. And I think you've said, and as we've worked our way through each of these issues, each one is so complex. To try to think about reaching some comprehensive solution to these varying and complex immigration issues maybe is just unrealistic. And I think, as you've also pointed out, times change, demographics changes, our economy changes, the places where people are migrating from changes over time. So why try to think in terms of trying to reach a comprehensive solution to all of these issues? And maybe as a practical matter, and I think you've commented on this, and maybe we can wrap up by asking you, maybe a deal can be made by giving President Trump his wall, knowing that it's highly unlikely as a practical matter that wall will ever actually be built as a wall, as a physical wall, and get something for that, get some of the things that whether it's Dreamers and DACA and some of these other things that would really make a profound difference. Try to strike a deal and a compromise in some way that includes giving the president his wall.
Yeah, and I think you're right. I mean, that seems to be a direction that things could go. And I think that's a direction that we would support. The challenge is, and I think we've sort of touched on it as well, is that everything in immigration is somewhat related to other things, right? Whatever you do is going to have impacts on other parts of the immigration system. So, you do need to understand that if you're going to make this sets of changes, whatever deal that is, that's going to have impacts that you're probably going to have to deal with in subsequent legislation. There's also the issue of everybody kind of wants to see their priority taken care of, whatever that is, whether it's changes to legal immigration system or legalization or border security. They want to see their priority taken care of. One of the issues we have right now is that there is so little trust between the parties in Congress or between Congress and the president that if they were to do a smaller deal on just pieces of it, that any of that other stuff would ever get done. And so if you don't trust that there'll be more coming, that deal can pave the way for the rest of the system to be dealt with, then your incentive is to hold up that small deal until your thing can get on board. And that's what we have seen. Unless or until we can find a way to rebuild that trust that, yes, we are going to deal with all of these things, maybe just not all at once, but we will get to them. It's going to be very hard politically for members in Congress and for the White House to accept a smaller package, if you will. And I think that's one of the big issues that is preventing Congress from actually moving forward on this.
And certainly now, as we enter the high season, going into the midterm elections in November, it seems unlikely that anything on the broad spectrum of immigration issues is going to get done this year, right? It seems like whatever's going to happen, if anything, will be next year at the earliest.
Yeah, both parties are definitely playing up immigration in the way that's most favorable to them for the upcoming election. So the president is reaching out to his base. He's promising more security. He's blaming Democrats for not getting it done, trying to gin up his base in the midterm elections. And Democrats are doing the same, blaming Trump for the family separation policy and immigration. The whole abolish ICE movement, which we didn't even talk about. They're trying to gin up their base as well to come out and vote. And the opportunities for legislation in Congress are limited, in part because right now both parties are trying to figure out where their advantage is, right? So if Democrats were to take back the House, then it's to their advantage to wait to do any immigration legislation until they have control of at least one House of Congress. And then they can mold immigration legislation more to their liking. Republicans are in the same way, right? If voting on immigration legislation now and making compromises that their base won't like will hurt their turnout in the midterm elections, they don't want to take those votes right now. So right now, certainly the elections and the politics are the priority for those in Congress, and everybody's looking at every vote with an eye toward how it will play out in the midterms. There's a possibility, depending on how things come out, that in the lame duck after November, when they will have to fund the government, there might be some deals that could be had then. We have to see. But certainly the next serious window may have to wait until 2019. And then we have to see how willing the parties are to make those compromises and to try to make a deal, and if they'll stick to it.
Theresa Cardinal Brown, Director of Immigration for the Bipartisan Policy Center in Washington, D.C. This has been a fantastic conversation. I will be paying close attention as the immigration debate continues, and our listeners will too, with the benefit of having you walked us through these issues so well and having explained things so thoroughly. Thank you so much for being on Good Law, Bad Law. I can't thank you enough.
You're so welcome. It was a great conversation.
Thank you, Theresa.